The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. You can't read the label from inside the jar. Disruptive truth bombs about criminology, implementation science, and real world. A recorded version of the webinar will be made available next week to all those who were not able to make it today. We would love to hear from you, so feel free to post your questions throughout the session, and we will designate the last 10 minutes to respond to your questions. Just a quick note, as far as this webinar goes, we do have over 250 people that have registered for this webinar, so we might be going over about 10 or 15 minutes at the end because we are anticipating a lot of questions at the end. Again, without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter today, Glenn Tapia, from the Alliance for Criminal Justice Innovation. Glenn, thanks for joining us, and you can go ahead and take over.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks everybody for joining. I've got a lot of content today that I'm going to share with you, and so I'm going to skip some of the pleasantries and just kind of talk a little bit about setting up what I'm going to be talking about today and get right into the content and leave enough time at the end for some questions. This is my 32nd year in the criminal justice system here in Colorado, and I've learned a lot in that time. About 27 years of that has been spent in some form of corrections, either institutional or community-based. And I've learned a lot, especially in the last 10 years, about some of the real-world trials of organizational change and implementation science and criminology. And I kind of feel like we have been, at the national level, there's been this, the national conversation has been in this uninterrupted vortex of a conversation around criminology. And my goal today is to disrupt that vortex and introduce some new elements to it, because I think we're not doing a good job in thinking a little bit outside the jar, so to speak, about what we need to do to affect real world change, given some of the unique properties of the criminal justice system. So when I talk about criminology, I'm going to be talking about a pretty narrow definition of criminology, which should be familiar to all of you in the kind of correctional or community-based supervision space. So when I say criminology today, I'm going to be talking specifically about the kind of narrow piece of risk needs responsivity, or what we would call evidence-based practice. I'll call it EBP for short today. The principles of effective intervention, sanctions and incentives, that kind of suite of research, I guess we can say, is what I'm talking about when I say criminology. And I'm using this metaphor of a jar and a butterfly inside a jar very intentionally today. I use the metaphor of a butterfly to symbolize organizational change, and for the reasons that might not be what you think. It's a bit of a cliche for change, and I'll present why in a little bit. I use the butterfly for organizational change, but for now we'll just say that the butterfly represents organizational change, and the jar is really a metaphor for three things. The jar represents the limitations of our thinking as change leaders. It represents the boundaries of criminology as I've just defined it. And it also represents some of the restrictions that are placed with organizational culture. And so the metaphor of the butterfly in a jar is really to symbolize that organizational change is really trapped and limited inside the boundaries of our thinking as change leaders, as the kind of box of criminology, and certainly inside the restrictions and boundaries of our organizational culture in the criminal justice system. So that's the premise of what I'm working with today. So as we go through the presentation, that's kind of where I'm starting from. I was at the APPA Executive Leadership Summit recently, and I heard this once again for the 7,000th time with some other executive leaders in the system, that we can't expect our staff to use the principles of effective intervention, or EBP, unless the leadership uses the same principles with our staff. And I've heard this so many times in the last 15 years. And the idea is that we have this criminology problem of staff not using evidence-based practice, or not doing it well enough, or not with fidelity, or not at all, and we don't have the right outcomes happening. So we have this idea that it's a criminology problem, and that we solve that problem with a criminology solution at the leadership or organizational level. It's almost like if the thinking there is we use criminology to solve a criminology problem at the organizational level. And so our conversation has been with a lot of leadership in the criminal justice system around circular conversations around R&R and APPA and those types of things. And I'm going to come back to this statement later in the presentation, but I believe that the premise is wrong in this statement. I believe that our criminal justice system outcomes aren't a criminology problem. I believe that they're symptomatic of much deeper and more complex problems that underlie our strategies and our organizations to affect change, and with our organizations themselves. So I'm beginning to set the framework here that we have to start thinking outside the jar and not think of our outcomes as a problem and think of them as a symptom. And if they are a symptom, then criminology is only going to be good enough to address the symptom, and we have to start thinking about addressing the problem. So that's the first truth that I'm working with here, which sounds a little twisted because if you think very literally of the dictionary definitions of, say, recidivism and criminology, and you put those side by side, you think, well, recidivism is like a relapse of crime and criminology is the scientific study of crime, so how then is recidivism not a criminology problem? So that's what I'm going to be setting up throughout the course of the webinar today. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I believe that and to see if you might agree with me at the end of the presentation. And to give you a little bit of context for why I believe that, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about a timeline about kind of where I've been and where I come from when I'm making this argument. And in Colorado in the early 1990s, our state legislature passed a law. We refer to it as House Bill 1173 from 1991. The law was intended to reduce recidivism, and the law, in large part, required standardized assessment for all offenders at the state level. So that's all of probation, all of parole, all of community corrections, and all state prisoners, which at the time in 1991 was about 100,000 offenders on any given day. So the idea was, we thought that was going to affect organizational change and reduce recidivism way back in 1991. Now keep in mind, in 1991, I barely had cut off my mullet. We were still working off of VHS. We weren't using email in the workplace. This is a long time ago. And we were thinking at the time that using risk and need assessments was going to really help us reduce recidivism at a large scale across the state. So throughout the 1990s, we went on a very aggressive training to train the entire state in risk needs assessments and the LSI. We imported the LSI from Canada. And about that time is when Bonta and Andrews, the R&R model, started really being purveyed throughout the country from Canada. And we were doing a lot of work to train staff in the LSI and risk need assessment and criminogenic needs and all that and so on and so forth, really thinking we were going to be getting good organizational change. The conversation started changing in the early 2000s. For me personally, it was about 2002 or 2003 when Faye Taxman produced the Tools of the Trade article. I sat with that article, which was pretty thick, and dissected it and realized that the strategies to affect change with offenders was much larger than simple risk need assessment and criminogenic needs. And there were other strategies and other science that was broader than just R&R. And later, that conversation turned into the principles of effective intervention. The conversation of evidence-based practice started really taking hold in the country. And then we thought we had a bigger model for organizational change, and we started then purveying that throughout the state, thinking that that was really going to get us the change that we needed. So we started preaching evidence-based practice and putting it into our contracts and wrapping programs around it and writing grants and selling it from the rafters and doing all that stuff to get organizational change. 2010, we kind of stumbled across, through a grant process, implementation science, and we adopted the National Implementation Research Network model. It's one of the more popular models that are out there, and we adopted that in 2010, realizing that we needed good implementation strategies to affect change with evidence-based practice. So then we really thought we were going to get organizational change with that. And so my perspective today in 2019 is 9 years of using implementation science at fairly large scales and helping other states do the same thing, and looking backwards, way back into the early 1990s, and learning a lot about what is and what isn't organizational change with all that in mind. So truth number 2 is I really believe that we need criminology, but we can't confuse criminology with organizational change. And later I'm going to give you a more concrete definition of organizational change, but criminology, the way I see it, is in the necessary but insufficient category to get to the organizational change that we need to affect the outcomes that we're trying to accomplish. So when we start talking about implementation, in Colorado we kind of talk about it as 2 gaps. There's this gap which we can call the criminology gap or the science to service gap, which is what the staff do at the line level with our offender population, say, and if what they're doing with the clients is not informed by research, we can close that gap with criminology. And that's where criminology helps us, is to close that gap from the line level staff to the direct service to the clients. And that's where criminology is helpful. Where criminology is not helpful is in this larger gap that's much more difficult, which we would call the implementation gap, which is the implementation gap, the way we see it, is when the EBP or the criminology is not used with fidelity, or not for a long enough period of time, or not on a large enough scale. The bottom line here is that it's not used with enough fidelity or scale to get the potency that it needs to get the outcomes that it's been researched to support. And so we can't close the implementation gap with criminology solutions, which begins to think, well, we need to think outside the jar of simple criminology and widen the conversation at least to implementation science. I'm going to make the case later that it's beyond that, but at least to implementation science, which in my experience, we really aren't having much of that conversation at the national level in some of our conferences, leadership development, and things like that. So if we think about some of the kind of global data about change, HBR would tell us that 70% of chop-down change initiatives fail to reach their desired mark. HBR would call that theory E type of change, which is when, essentially when the management decides to initiate a change and then kind of take a top-down change strategy with that. 70% of bottom-up change initiatives fail. That would be considered theory O, and about 70% of critical mass change initiatives fail. Those are very high failure rates, and the problem is that those are very generous failure rates for the criminal justice system. I actually wished we had sometimes some of those outcomes. But the idea here is that no matter how we direct change, whether it's top-down, bottom-up, or critical mass, our failure rates, globally speaking, are rather high. So if you think about it if you look at this image here with these 2 dudes talking about change, one is talking to the other, and they're looking at the science to the left, which could be criminology, and they're trying to get the outcomes, which is this gobbledygook to the right. And then in the middle, they're just expecting some miracle to happen and thinking that we don't have to apply some kind of science to make the miracle happen to get the outcomes. And the argument here is that we need to have very good implementation strategies to get the science to work for us. Traditionally, our implementation methods, I kind of jokingly call them these 2-step simple methods. There's the persuade and repeat method, and that method is what I've seen happen. Imagine going to your first APPA conference or ICCA conference or something back in the day, and you're persuaded that evidence-based practice is the right thing to do, or you're going to jump on the EPICS model or STICS or a CBT program or motivational interviewing or whatever. You're persuaded that that's the right thing to do. You then take that back home, you repeat that persuasion back to your people. Doesn't seem to work that well, and you go back to the conference again a couple of years later, you hear the same presentation, you go back to your home organization, and you repeat that cycle. And that persuade and repeat method just doesn't seem to work to persuade people to get real lasting organizational change. The more prominent method is train and pray. And this is when I think this is where most organizations sit, where we decide we're going to bring in some evidence-based innovation, you know, EPICS or MI or risk assessment or CBT program or whatever it takes. And we go on this comprehensive training program, maybe even go to the extent of doing training for trainers and do a large-scale training. And then we pray that it's going to get us the results that it is intended to. And what we neglect to remember is that in a classroom environment, people are only going to retain about 20% of what they learn in a classroom. And then of that 20%, they're only going to retain about 20% of that 20% after they get out of the classroom. And none of that is going to translate into actual skills practice and utilization of the skills in the real world. So we might say, okay, well, we'll do a booster training. And the reality is that training alone just doesn't get us anywhere, and prayer certainly doesn't help us in the real world with complex organizations. And then there's the people who kind of take the, I'm going to get real serious and put it in policy and procedure two-step method. And that's when the top-down kind of method says, we're going to get really serious about this, and we're going to put it in our standards and our policy and our procedure, and we're going to make people do this, and it's going to show that we're really serious as an organization about employing evidence-based risk reduction, and we're going to do it with paper methods, which is policy and procedure. And the reality is that the implementation research has told us that disseminating information alone, or classroom training when used alone, or passing laws, mandates, regulation, standards, even providing funding incentives or doing simple reorganization strategies, any of those methods when used alone are insufficient to get to lasting change. And the data would show that about 5 to 15% of any of those methods realize their intended outcomes. Now, I just got done telling you that we have a 70% failure rate, and these data here are even worse, looking at 5 to 15%. So you might think, okay, well, let's choose all of these methods. Let's do all of these things. And the idea with implementation science is it's well beyond these simple methods, and there are other strategies to affect change beyond just these overused and ineffective methods. So we talk about it sometimes as like, you know, if criminology is the serum that gets us to affect the outcomes, then our implementation methods is really the syringe. And if you think about that metaphor, a serum is not really effective or potent unless you have a syringe as the delivery method to get it at the right dosage. And so our implementation methods, and specifically the science, we can think about that as the syringe, with the idea that if we have an effective criminology solution but an ineffective implementation method, we're not going to get good results that aren't sustained. And you can imagine situations when you have a really good program, a good evidence-based program, and you might get initial results. You might have seen this in some of your grant projects or in some of your real-world situations where you start to see your outcomes bend, or you start to see staff skills go up, or you start to see some organizational change, but then the change starts to erode back to status quo after a year or two. And that's in large part because the inefficacy of the implementation methods. So the basic idea is not only do we have to have effective science on the criminology space, but we have to have effective science in the implementation as well. So you can kind of think of it as like 3 levels of implementation, or maybe 3 degrees of implementation. We talk about it oftentimes as like there's paper level implementation, which is that policy and procedure level implementation, which is what a lot of organizations rely on. You know, they'll write a grant, they'll put everything in their grant proposal, and they'll maybe go so far as to put it in policies and procedures and develop all kinds of forms and maybe even put it in some job descriptions and things like that. But at the end of the day, that it really is not organizational change and does not get the outcomes that we need. Process level is kind of the next or deeper level, and that's when we can see it at the paper level, but also in other official processes that start to get to staff skills. That's when we're talking about training and maybe even put in performance appraisals of staff where there's feedback from supervisor to staff about attending training or how they did in training or things like that. A lot of people stop, however, at the process level thinking that that's organizational change, which I'm making the argument today that that is not. Performance level implementation is when the criminology solution or the evidence-based practice is deeply integrated in the culture and outcomes and results are seen as a result. And so the key words there are deeply integrated. Another key word, into the organizational culture. That means it has to be part of the culture, and the outcomes and results are seen as a result of that integration into the culture. That is what I'm going to argue is the definition of organizational change. Process level implementation is not organizational change. Paper level is not organizational change. I believe that performance level is what we're talking about is organizational change. Once it's integrated in the culture, once the new thing becomes the normal thing, and we start to see the outcomes, that is what I'm talking about constitutes organizational change. So the truth is, before we can expect to even see the outcome, we have to see the change. And we have to see the change not in the classroom, not in the paper, but we have to see lasting and pervasive change at the organizational level. That means at the culture. That means it's a habit. That means it's the norm. And that's the hard part. So I'm going to talk fairly briefly about one of the frameworks in the National Implementation Research model. There's not enough time to really go deeply into it. This is known as the driver's framework. The idea here is that Dean Fixon and his folks have basically concluded that there's 8 drivers of good effective implementation strategies. You can kind of think of these as key ingredients or active ingredients of good implementation. And the idea is that these 8 active ingredients or key drivers kind of cluster into 3 categories that you can see on the 3 sides of this triangle. And if all 8 of these are present, then your chances for fidelity or program quality are increased. So I'm going to talk about these fairly briefly just to show you the basics of what these key ingredients are from Nern's model. In the bucket of staff competency, it's about staff selection, training, and coaching. And the idea here is that staff selection means not just who you choose to do your EBP, not who you're just choosing for motivational interviewing or whatever. It's inclusive of that, but how you hire people and who you hire, and even down to the granularity of what your interview questions look like and what your hiring methods look like. Are you hiring for character and skills or just skills? Are you hiring for just knowledge? And what about character is it you're hiring? Are you hiring for attitudinal alignment with the EBP, those types of things? Training, again, necessary. Coaching sounds fairly simple, but it's really about staff getting performance feedback about their skill development and doing skill rehearsal and getting performance feedback about their skill development. It's kind of cyclical coaching, ongoing coaching from trained coaches, skilled coaches. That's really where the learning happens. And so the idea here is that these 3 areas here of selecting the right staff, training them, and coaching them in ongoing ways are helpful to get to fidelity with your innovation. On the organizational side, these 3 areas, they have kind of funky words. The idea here is that the organization is hospitable to the EBP. Systems intervention essentially means that the organization clears the path for the EBP ahead of time and solves problems along the way. Facilitative administration in an overgeneralization essentially means that the organization, the administration, makes room for the staff to attend training and coaching and fidelity measurement so that their skills develop for the EBP. The idea is that the management has a hospitable environment for the staff to employ the EBP, and that decisions are made on good quality data about the EBP, about the outcomes, about fidelity, those type of things. And then in the leadership bucket, Dean and his folks kind of boil it down to, it's not just about technical leadership, you also have to have good adaptive leadership. You can think of those in very gross overstatements as technical leadership is the black and white areas of change, adaptive leadership are more the kind of gray, ambiguous areas of change. And the idea is that these 8 things, if used with good strategies in these 8 areas, get you to better fidelity and better program quality, with the idea that better fidelity and program quality get you to better outcomes. We're going to come back to this in a minute, but these data right here show you the importance of fidelity. It'll take a minute to get your eyes understanding this, and I'll kind of walk through this with you carefully. When you look at these data here, these are 25 sites. So if you look at my pointer here, I'm going to bring my pointer up here if I can. These are 25 sites here. Each one of these horizontal bars are 25 sites that implemented an EBP called functional family therapy. And anybody above this black horizontal line, these are 12 sites that implemented FFT and did so with above the fidelity criteria. And you can see this red line right here represents their recidivism rate at about 13%. So the idea is that these 12 sites that did FFT with fidelity have a recidivism rate at about 13%. Now these 13 sites down here used the same FFT innovation, the same EBP, did not meet the fidelity criteria and had more than double the recidivism rate of the 12 sites that did achieve the fidelity markers. This orange line is kind of the mean of the entire group, so it's not really important. What's important are the difference between these 2 red lines. The learning here is that all 25 of these sites used the same innovation. These 12 sites did it well and with good implementation methods and got less than half the recidivism rate of these 13 sites that didn't do it well with good implementation. They got more than double the recidivism rate. So here, this is really good data to show it's not about the EBP, it's really about the implementation. And there's lots of other data in the implementation science space about that. This is just one example to make the case. So in learning the lessons that we have learned about using implementation science in the real world, here's what we have learned in the most global sense, is in the real world, when you start using implementation science, again, the NERD model, you start experiencing problems in any one of these drivers. The administration starts kind of losing their support, and then the coaching starts falling apart, and then you start having turnover, which means staff selection starts becoming a problem. The administration gets distracted, and so they no longer start intervening in the EBP, and eventually the EBP starts losing its potency, and you start realizing that these areas that I'm showing here as symptoms really show up to be symptomatic of leadership problems that are at the technical and adaptive level. And a colleague and I, who had been using some of these implementation science strategies for almost a decade, had been journaling our experiences for about 9 years. And we're journaling all of our failures and experiences and just different lessons that we have learned, and really understood and really found out that the technical and adaptive leadership components explained part of it, but there were some other missing pieces, and there were some leadership attributes that were missing and some organizational cultural problems that could not be explained by the implementation drivers. I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. But in the real world of using implementation science, you start to learn that implementation science in and of itself is not organizational change. The truth is we need implementation science, but in and of itself, it is not the panacea to get us the organizational change that we need. It's, again, in that kind of necessary but insufficient category. And by the same token, technical and adaptive leadership are in that same category of insufficient, but are necessary but insufficient. And there's more to leadership than just simple technical and adaptive styles. We really found out that not all the leadership problems could be explained by technical and adaptive leadership attributes. And we had to do some work to kind of reconcile where some of those gaps were left. And so, yes, we need implementation science, but that's not organizational change. We need to do something better with leadership as well. There's another gap that was left with leadership. So to set up some of the other truths that I'm going to set out, there's also some lies that I think we have been told in the criminal justice system about organizational change, and it's important to understand some of these lies. One of the lies is why I use the butterfly as the metaphor for organizational change. You know, I'm just going to talk to you straight. I was one of those ambitious people that, you know, learned about evidence-based risk reduction and implementation science and jumped on board and thought I was going to do this really glamorous thing of organizational change. And it was going to be this graceful, magical, and beautiful process of inside-out transformation and was going to save the world. And the butterfly is a really good metaphor for that because we're taught to believe that the butterfly is the symbol for change because it's inside out and it's one way and it's, you know, this beautiful transformation from this insect into a more evolved insect and all that stuff. And you can see the picture here where the caterpillar goes into this cocoon and then the cocoon evolves into this butterfly, and it's this kind of peaceful, quiet, intimate, restful process. And frankly put, that's bullshit. What we're not told about is what happens inside that damn cocoon. And what happens inside that cocoon for the butterfly is that insect is broken down into a gelatinous mass, and it's changed at the biochemical level. It's changed at the cellular level. And I'm guessing if you ask that caterpillar what that was like, that caterpillar dude is not going to say, yeah, it was graceful, magical, and beautiful. It sucked, and it hurt, and it was painful, and it was awful. Nobody gets to see that, though, because the cocoon is closed, and we have this illusion that it's this peaceful and intimate, relaxing process, and this butterfly goes in this catatonic state and comes out evolved, and everything's great. Well, when we open up that cocoon and start talking about real-world organizational change, it is brutal, and to get real, lasting change, it sucks. And I believe that that's why we have that 70% failure rate and that 5 to 15% success rate, is because most organizations stop when they get to the cocoon because it hurts. And I think there's a lot of organizational cocoons, so to speak, that are not hospitable to change. And I have a belief that the 30% of organizations that get to the butterfly are the ones that are strong enough culturally and through leadership to get through that awful phase of the cocoon. And I don't think we're doing a very good job equipping leadership and organizations to deal with that cocoon. We've also been lied to that organizational change in the criminal justice system is linear. This is the Kubler-Ross change curve. I don't know who Kubler and Ross are, but they're liars. You know, they give us this idea that organizational change has a beginning and an end, and that it's linear, and that, you know, you just go through a little bit of stress, and then everything gets better and better, and then it's done. That is a lie. Organizational change is not that simple. It is not that linear, and it does not have a beginning or an end. So Kubler and Ross, you lied to us. This is Dr. John Cotter. He believes that there's an 8-step change process. And if you just kind of look at some of his categories here, I mean, look at number 7 and 8. Don't let up and just make it stick and everything's going to be great. The idea here is that change just gets better and better over time, and it's linear, and everything's fine. That's a lie. This one, Lewin's model, strangely enough, a lot of people believe that all organizational change can be explained by Lewin's model, which is 3 simple steps. You just unfreeze, and then you change, and then you refreeze. It's really that simple. You just determine what needs to change and create some urgency. That's unfreeze. Change means you do some stuff, and then refreeze means you stop changing. And I don't know about you all, but I don't live in a world when organizations stop changing and when you have the ability to freeze and unfreeze on any given day. I think there's a lot of times when we're freezing about one thing and unfreezing about another thing and refreezing about another thing and changing another thing and unfreezing about this and refreezing about that. And this is a lie. So the model that I do believe is closer to the truth, and it's one that we teach in our 3-day academy with implementation leadership, comes from the adaptive leadership space. This is known as the productive zone of disequilibrium. There's not enough time to go over this in depth, and we go a lot into depth with this in our leadership academy, but the idea here is that the horizontal axis is time, the vertical axis is chaos, and there's these 3 zones. So this bottom zone down here, you can kind of think of that as our comfort zone. This gray zone here in the middle, that's our productive zone of disequilibrium. That's the change zone. And then this upper zone here at the top, that's the kind of chaos zone. And the idea here is that when people go through change, we have to get them out of their comfort zone into the productive zone of disequilibrium, which means we need to get them uncomfortable enough, but not so uncomfortable that it's chaotic. And a good leader will help us navigate people through the productive zone, but out of the comfort zone. And over time, people vacillate in and out of this productive zone. In the real world, I think people often like to live and stay in their comfort zone. That's where some of these lines kind of suggest that people like to cop out and go back into their comfort zone. The idea here is that change can't happen in your comfort zone. And so good leadership will help people navigate and stay outside of their comfort zone, but not so uncomfortable that it's chaotic. I was working with the state one time to educate them about this, and one of the change leaders said, "Oh, I get it. I kind of think of it like straight lights," she said. She said, "You can kind of think of it as the bottom zone's like the green, and the middle zone's the yellow, and the upper zone is the red. So the green is like the go zone, that's the happy zone, and the yellow zone is like, oh, things are getting rough, and the red zone is like, oh, we gotta slam on the brakes." And while I appreciate where she's going with that, I really fully disagree that that's what this model suggests. If we're going to use the streetlights as a metaphor for the productive zone of disequilibrium, here's the way it works. The productive zone of disequilibrium is the green zone. That's the zone that we want to be in. That's the uncomfortable zone. The zone that we want to pump the brakes and downshift and slow down is the chaos zone. The danger zone is our comfort zone. That's the red zone. That's the zone that we do not want to be in. And this starts to help me understand why people get stuck in that cocoon of change, so to speak, or why organizations don't live through organizational change. Because culturally speaking, we expect a change in our comfort zone. And I'm going to make that case in just a minute. But I think that good change leaders will help people get out of their comfort zone and live outside their comfort zone and navigate through that process. And organizations don't like to live outside of their comfort zone, especially criminal justice organizations. And I'm going to show you a rubric for that in just a minute. But the productive zone of disequilibrium starts to help us understand that this comfort zone, if you think about the comfort zone of an organization, is dangerous to change. And an EBP will die in the comfort zone. And I believe in large part, that's why criminology dies sometimes, is because we expect it to live in our comfort zone. And I think we've been told that change leadership kind of looks like this really symmetrical process where there's some person out front and everybody's following them and all this kind of stuff. And the real world is that this is what leadership really looks like, change leadership really looks like. It's a freaking mess. You know, think about that cocoon. And the question I want you to think about is, are we equipping leaders and are we equipping organizations to deal with this stress in a healthy and happy way and equip other leaders to deal with the same amount of stress? Because that's the real world. When you start applying implementation science and change, that's our real world. And I don't think that we're doing a good job equipping future leaders and current leaders with skills and mindset strategies and tools to deal with that real change. So this is a little bit where we come from when a colleague and I, Dr. Brandon Matthews and I told you we were journaling our experiences for about 9 years. I got to the end of my journal and I was getting ready to start a new one, and I decided to kind of look back in my journal and extract some themes. And I told him, I said, you know, my experiences boil down to about 10 things. And he said, oh, I've been doing the same thing, and let's compare notes. And what we found was that in addition to the technical and adaptive leadership, there are 10 drivers or 10 principles of effective implementation leadership that we found are really necessary to deal with that chaotic environment of using implementation science. And what I'm about to show you is far too much I don't have enough time to really show you what's basically coming in an 11-chapter book and what we educate people in a 3-day academy. So I'm just going to kind of give you a real thumbnail sketch of this. It's just not enough time to go through what we do in this 3-day academy that we do. But the idea here is that we have these 10 principles that we educate people on that are much more real world, supported by the research, yet kind of educate people on how to really understand how to apply implementation science to real world change. And the one I'm going to focus on specifically is number 6, which is culture is king. And I'm going to zero in on that one specifically in just a minute, but I just wanted to kind of show you that it's well beyond just technical and adaptive leadership. It's well beyond, those are included in the implementation leadership model, but there's more to it than just those 2 simple constructs. And so we educate people about these 10 principles, and we have this 3-day academy. If you're interested, I'm giving you the website here. We're doing one in July in Denver. But I'm just going to focus on culture is king, because that really is key to understanding the message that I am delivering today. And what I mean by culture is, this is my own personal definition of organizational culture. There are lots of academic and kind of more formal definitions than what I'm offering today. But I think of culture as this underlying ecosystem of beliefs and thoughts and attitudes and perceptions and behaviors and traditions and habits of the collective sum of people in an organization. I really think of it like this ecosystem, and the organization's inputs and practices reinforce this ecosystem of beliefs, and the beliefs reinforce the organizational practices. And the problem with culture is that it's omnipresent, it's always around, but it's so impalpable and invisible, and so because of that, we neglect it in our change efforts. Organizational culture is this thing that, because it's immaterial and hard to quantify sometimes without tools, we just kind of space it out and we just overlook it. And I don't think we've done a good job in equipping change leaders with an ability to recognize organizational culture and deal with strategies to address it. Now, the problem is that in the public sector, and especially in criminal justice, culture is more powerful than any budget, any leader, any policy, any strategy, any set of politics, and any damn law. And that's the truth. Culture is more powerful than any one of those things whether you pass a law or fund a grant or have a transformational leader or whatever it takes, culture is much more powerful than that, and that includes criminology, and that includes implementation science and crap. That means culture wins unless we know how to deal with it. The idea here is that organizational change is held hostage inside our organizational cultures of the criminal justice system, and that our criminology solutions and our implementation science solutions are impeded by our organizational culture, and this is real world. And if our culture is not hospitable to implementation science and our implementation strategies are not hospitable to criminology, we're one of those 70% failure statistics and maybe one of those 95% failure statistics. And I don't believe we've done a good job of bringing, let alone implementation science, in the national conversation, but I don't think we've done a good job bringing organizational science into the conversation to help us release that butterfly from the jar, so to speak. So the truth is that culture is king. You know, culture eats implementation strategy and science for breakfast and lunch and is still hungry for dinner. Culture can win. So this framework here, this is 4 types of organizational culture, 4 profiles of organizational culture. In our Leadership Academy, we actually help people assess with a tool their organizational culture, and the assessment will give you a picture of your organizational culture, I guess you can say, or a profile along these 4 domains. I'm just going to go over these really quickly, but the idea is that even an immaterial thing like culture, we can measure and we can estimate what it looks like and get an idea of what it looks like, and these are pretty predictable cultures in the organizational science space. The client culture is kind of that family nurturing, trust-based, open, people-oriented, teamwork-based culture. And some organizations have that as part of their culture. Your culture that is more kind of adhocracy is that kind of innovation, autonomous, new and unique products kind of culture. It's that culture that is really about entrepreneurship and all that kind of stuff. Your market-based culture is that competitive, stretch the targets, beat the competition. It's all about achievement. You know, it's Nike crushing Adidas and Adidas crushing Nike type of culture. And then your hierarchy culture is that controlled, bureaucratic, highly structured, predictable, policy, rule-oriented, dependable, stable culture. That starts to look a lot like our criminal justice culture. In a lot of spaces. I mean, we all have attributes of these to our culture, but hierarchy definitely dominates a lot of criminal justice organizations. So the tool will help us understand and measure what our culture looks like, and then we can kind of deal with what to do to address it. So if you remember these implementation drivers that I presented earlier, remember those 8 active ingredients that I presented and those kind of 8 drivers that the Fixin model promotes. Dr. Matthews did some research on some sites here in Colorado, and his inquiry was to study the statistical relationship, if any, between the different cultures, cultural profiles that I just showed you, and the 8 drivers of implementation, to see if there was any relationship between different cultures and the drivers. And so he went and assessed organizations for their driver capacity, and then assessed them on their culture, and then statistically compared those data. And in the data that you're looking at, if you see a asterisk, that means it's statistically significantly correlated. If you see the green shades, that basically means it's correlated in a healthy way. The red means in an unhealthy way. So what this basically tells you is that the clan and adhocracy cultures are very friendly, statistically significantly so, to good implementation strategies. The market culture is kind of neutral, and the hierarchy culture is statistically significantly inversely related, which means it's inhospitable to implementation strategies. Yikes. That's our criminal justice culture, people. And that's the problem that we're dealing with. It doesn't have to be permanent. I just don't believe that we have done a good job equipping leaders to deal with that reality. Are we expecting implementation to live in hierarchy cultures, and are we expecting EBPs to live in hierarchy-based cultures? And then we wonder why we have such a high failure rate. That's the story right there. So the reality is this. If you think of our criminal justice system culture, which is averse to risks, that is opposite of the change culture, which is inviting of risks. The change culture is about like entrepreneurship and inviting risks and bringing in risks and welcoming risks. The criminal justice system culture is all about stability and control and order and structure. But the change culture is about innovation and experimentation and trial and error and experimentation and failure and all these things. The criminal justice system culture is about conforming to rules and policies and solving problems with rules and policies. The change culture is about diverging from status quo and putting off the idea of rules and policies until it figures some things out. The criminal justice system is trapping innovation and trapping change in the jar because of its culture. The change culture could liberate change if we knew how to deal with it. And I don't think that we know quite how to deal with it because we haven't introduced organizational science into our conversation at some of the conferences and some of the leadership development that we have been doing. So remember those statistics that I showed you from HBR, Harvard Business Review, about the kind of failure rates of strategies? I think about it like this. Organizations and systems are perfectly designed to get the outcomes that we get. I want you to just think about that for a second. Your organization and your system and my system are perfectly designed to get our outcomes. Our outcomes aren't some strange anomaly of some other outside problem. It's about the way that our organization is designed. Our outcomes are about the organization, not necessarily about the practices. So the idea here is that organizational culture and our leadership acumen is the dominant driver here. And if that is healthy, then we can have good implementation strategies. And if those are intact, then we can have good criminology solutions. And if that is intact, then we have good practices. If then our practices are good, then we can get some good outcomes. And the problem that I have seen is that we have been having this vortex of conversations at our conferences and in leadership development around criminology. And we're circulating conversations around criminology and only around criminology and not talking enough about implementation science and not talking enough about organizational science and leadership acumen. And the reality is that we need organizational science to deal with organizational problems and leadership problems. We need implementation science to deal with implementation problems and criminology to deal with criminology problems. And the argument that I'm making today is that the jar that we need to think outside of and the jar that we need to open and get outside and look at is that criminology is the smaller construct here. It's part of the equation, but that we need to think outside of criminology and thinking into implementation and organizational science. So the truth is that organizational change cannot happen without culture change. And we need organizational science, not criminology, to guide us in addressing organizational culture. Remember that statement that I started the webinar with, which was that kind of thing that we've heard a lot, that if staff aren't using EBP, then leaders can use EBP to deal with staff that aren't using EBP, or the idea that leaders have to walk the talk of EBP if we expect staff to use EBP, or however we want to see that. Well, the way I see it is this. The real deal is that our outcomes are not a criminology problem. They're a symptom of an organizational change problem. And criminal justice leaders, we need organizational change skills, not criminology skills. When I go to a leadership development course or when I go to leadership development and I'm talking with executive leaders, I'm not sure that I should be talking criminology. I think we should be talking organizational science and leadership acumen and maybe even political science, because those are the problems that we're dealing with. And it's the staff that need the criminology skills, but our leadership and our organizations, we need to introduce new science bases into our conversations at the national level to help our future leaders understand what it's like to deal with real-world organizational change and implementation. So I think we need thought leadership at all levels to completely reimagine leadership development. We need to think outside the jar and build our leadership capacity and organizational change capacity for our leaders in the system. I'm out of this system in 10 years and I'll be retired, and I need to be able to equip the generation behind me to deal with organizational change and to deal with implementation. And I really believe that we should be doing that now. I think there's a sense of urgency. I was at the APPA Executive Leadership Summit recently, and Mark Carey was talking about how we need to get serious about evidence-based risk reduction and recidivism reduction. We've been talking about it for 20 years, and I fully agree with him that we have to get serious. Where I disagree with him is what the solution is. I would depart from him in thinking that the solution is a criminology solution. I think the solution is to bring other science bases into the conversation and introduce more different bodies of science into our conversations so that we can equip our future leaders and our current leaders with skills and tools to get organizational change. We must not solve organizational problems with criminology solutions. We cannot and we must not solve implementation problems with criminology solutions. We have to solve organizational problems with organizational solutions, implementation problems with implementation solutions, and criminology with criminology solutions. The bottom line is that we can't read the label from inside the jar. And so to really think outside of that means opening that jar, opening our thoughts, opening our organizational cultures, opening up our conversations beyond criminology, and affecting organizational change, which much better strategies. That's my argument today. I hope you enjoyed it. I really want to thank APPA for giving me the space to be able to talk about this. I'm very passionate about it. I cussed a lot less than I thought I was going to, so I'm going to give myself credit for that. And I'm open to taking any questions that people might have about the presentation.
Thank you, Glenn, for this presentation. We do have a couple of questions here. The first one is, are you able to share those slides afterwards with one of our attendees?
Yes, absolutely. You can email me. My email address is on the slide there, glenn@acji.org. You can email me and I will email you the slides in PDF format or PowerPoint, whatever you like.
Okay, we have a next question here. This is kind of long, so bear with me, please. In a society where risks sometimes equals people getting hurt or getting sued, will the criminal justice system ever not be risk averse?
That's a beautiful question. I'd like to think so. I think it's about taking organizational risks to be able to minimize those community risks, because the way that we are managing those risks, I mean, I think we have these fears of, if we do anything differently, we're going to get some kind of worse outcome and somebody's going to hurt somebody. And the reality is that whatever's happening now, those articles on the cover of the paper, those articles on the headlines, those articles that get social media are a direct reflection of what we're doing now. And people are scared to change what they're doing, thinking that those things are going to increase. And I think we have to be brave enough. We have to take the leap, so to speak. One of the principles in implementation leadership is called take the leap. We have to make very calculated decisions about what our change strategies are going to be, which is why we apply science. And then we have to take the leap. And I think we have to be courageous, and we have to be calculated and being willing to take those risks. Because the reality is that those risks aren't going away. And I really believe that we have to have that kind of courage. In the Implementation Leadership Academy, we say that the difference between fear and courage, people think that fear and courage are like opposites, that there's two people, one who's scared and there's one who is courageous, and there must be something different about the two of them. Courage, the only difference between courage and fear is that the person who's courageous has a well-developed plan, that they have the gumption that they're willing to use. But that person is still scared. And as an organization, we have to go in scared, but we have to have a well-executed plan that's informed by science, that we have the gumption that we're willing to use, so that we can say, I'm going to take the leap and execute this science-based, well-executed, implementation science-driven plan, and that's going to get us the change that we need. And I'm not 100% certain it's going to be right. I'm not 100% certain, and I'm going to be willing to fail. And I'm going to be willing to fail forward. One of our other principles in Implementation Leadership Academy is fail forward and fail often. And equipping leaders with the ability to say, I'm willing to take a fail on this one. And that's what it's going to take.
Thank you, Glenn. Got the next question here. Would you mind giving a specific example of some organizational change you have experienced and how you have implemented it within your own organization?
Can you repeat the question again?
Would you mind giving a specific example of some organizational change you have experienced and how you have implemented it within your own organization?
Within my own organization? Sure.
If applicable.
Yeah. This might be a little bit longer story than what's contemplated here, but I guess the easiest way for me to kind of talk about this experience is I lived in an organization for 19 years that was really lopsided in the way that it kind of functioned in the system. It was primarily a funding and regulatory agency and had very little technical assistance capacity. And the kind of culture of the organization when I stepped into it was really about funding and regulation. And it was an oversight agency for community corrections in Colorado. And there was very little capacity for kind of technical assistance. And our main cultural attributes were standards, contracts, and funding. And over the course of about nine, depends on kind of how you look at it, about 9 years, we had to transform the culture to be much better balanced between funding, regulation, and implementation, and really had to do the work to bring science into our standards. Our standards used to be, at one point, only 6% of our 125 standards were evidence-based. We transitioned that to almost 50% being evidence-based, which was just a simple reflection of how much work we had to do to bring science into the culture of the organization. And it was the standards that we transformed were backed by hundreds of highly regarded published research, and that was in and of itself an artifact of good staff selection and bringing really strong people into the organizations, putting them in situations where there was an environment for letting them innovate and letting them have free space to take some risks and innovate on their own and take some calculated risks, and just giving them enough space to be able to better balance the organization from one that was primarily regulatory to one that was much more balanced in regulation and implementation.
Thank you. Next question, understanding that culture in a workplace department is a large part of creating change, how can us as non-executives actually affect change and furthermore the culture?
Far too much to talk about in the time that we have left. That's why we have our 3-day academy, honestly, and that's why we have follow-up after our academy. But it starts with a mindset. I'll just tell you this, it starts with a mindset. It starts with a mindset that it's not somebody else's job in the organization to change the culture. If everybody in the organization starts with the mindset that it's not somebody else's job to change the culture, it starts there. Then the dialogue starts to have to happen around what type of a culture is most hospitable to what we want to employ. And that dialogue culture is really reinforced by the dialogue that happens at the water cooler, in the hallway, all that kind of stuff. And what we equip people to do is to start with changing the conversation about the mindset and take on the mindset that it's my freaking job to change the culture, and it's your job, and it's that dude's job, and it's that dude's job, and it's her job. And everybody has to have a role on it. It's not the leader's job. It's not the boss's job. It's the brand new staff person's job. It's everybody's job in that organization to change the culture. And if it starts from there and management helps with organizational tools to assess it and measure it and monitor it and change some things in the organization to make the organizational inputs or practices hospitable to what that dialogue is. I know that sounds very ambiguous, but it's a huge question that takes a lot of time to really answer that question concretely. But it really is about first identifying that you are the change agent as a staff person, and so is everybody else. Number two, identifying what culture it is you're shooting for and what's the right culture for you. And then number three, having the dialogue and the practices that are congruent with that culture. And it starts from those simple constructs.
Thank you. Next question, what is your recommendation for best model for organizational science leading to culture change?
Can you repeat the question again?
What is your recommendation for best model for organizational science leading to culture change?
I don't know that it's about a model. It's more about, let's just start the conversation about bringing organizational scientists into our conferences, and then we can start talking about the models. If we're willing to bring organizational scientists to do that, then I think we can start having the conversations about those models, because it really depends on the culture that we're trying to adopt. So it's really, I think it starts with, let's first bring those experts into the equation, and then we can start talking about the models, because I think if you go into the private sector and you go over to XYZ Incorporated, they have organizational development experts that are able to answer that question for their organizations. The criminal justice space doesn't do that. We don't even think about having organizational development experts in our organizations. We don't think about having organizational scientists speak at our conferences or change leaders talk at our conferences. And there's nothing against criminologists. I mean, we absolutely need that, but I think we just need to broaden that scope.
Right, thank you. And what are your recommendations for organizations that are impacted heavily by political change? For example, new governors or new executive staff that comes in and removes all the senior positions. Any recommendations for such organizations?
I believe culture wins that too. I saw an article recently about a federal organization that is resisting some political change to implement some innovations, some risk need assessments in the organization, and it's just a testament to how even political change can't change organizational attitudes. And I live in those same exact spaces. I'm an at-will employee myself. I'm appointed by the state court administrator in my job, and he's appointed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And then my last job, we were in the executive branch, and we got new governors all the time. And cultures are much more stable than our individual positions, and I think it's a misnomer to think that one or two key positions has the ability to change a culture. I think it can help shape a culture, but people neglect the power that staff and mid-level employees have in the shape of an organizational culture. Quite frankly, management's outnumbered. And I think culture is also a part of what are the habits of the organization, the practices, the legacy practices that live in an organization too. Those are also big parts of what the culture is. I'm familiar with an organization here in Colorado that solves much of its problems with paper strategies. They are an oversight agency for some providers, and a lot of times when they have problems with their providers, they just change the contracts, and they don't really have a culture of going out and like talking to people about the problems or doing implementation work. They just change contracts. And that's not attributable to the people. That's attributable to the practices of the organization. And that's not about, they'll get a new change leader in there, they'll get a new executive director, and they'll still continue to change contracts. They'll get another executive director and a different governor, they'll continue to change contracts. Until they make a decision to solve problems with something other than changing contracts, their method to solve problems with changing contracts is going to be the part of their cultural phenomenon. And that's going to be irrespective of who the governor is, who the legislature is, and who their executive director is. And so that organization needs to make a conscious decision to broaden their problem-solving approaches beyond paper methods. And it's just an example of how that cultural phenomenon is bigger than their executive director or the governor.
Great, thank you. We do have a lot of questions, but we only have time for one more. I am going to share all these questions with Glenn, and he will take on his own time. He is going to respond to you, hopefully, right, Glenn?
Yeah. So my email address is here. I think you said you would give me some email addresses. If you want, I can send this out to whoever's interested, and I'm happy to take. If you want to email me, you could see my email address. You're more than welcome to email me, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, and I'll share all these questions that are left here with Glenn right after we're done here, and he will respond to you. And thank you, everyone, for taking your time to attend this webinar. And Glenn, thank you again for this presentation. And we hope we can do this again soon.
Yeah, and thank you, APPA, and thank you all for sticking around. I know this kind of went over the hour, and there's a lot of stuff that I'm giving at you. And thanks for being open-minded. My job was here is to disrupt the conversation a little bit and maybe get people to think beyond what we're doing.
That's great. We are going to post this webinar in our APPA Connect, which is our online community. We hope that everyone can join in and continue the discussions there and respond to any thing that you saw here with your own ideas, and let's keep this conversation going. So again, the way to get to our APPA Connect, our online community, is through our APPA website. The website is www.appa-net.org, and from there you can access our online community. Again, thank you again to all those that attended, as well as to Glenn for participating in this webinar. Have a nice day, everyone.